So as many of you are well aware of by now, if you want to improve at chess, one of the most important things that you can be doing, if not the most important, is working on your calculation. So in today's video, I really want to break down one of the most fundamental, at least in my opinion, principles of calculation that I've touched upon here and there in some of my content, but I really want to dedicate a full video to. This is really, in my opinion, behind like most of the miscalculations or calculation mistakes that people make. So without further ado, let's get right into business. But to introduce this example to you guys, this is a really good example in my opinion. So we have a fairly solid position for both sides here. The position is probably roughly equal here. And one plan that black would love to go for is to play a move like knight h5 to knight f4 here and put this knight on this sort of nice outpost. However, one thing that may sort of occur to you when you look at this knight h5 idea is, well, it's sort of being eyed by the queen here. So what if white just takes this, we recapture somehow on e5, and then they play queen takes h5 there, and they're just a pawn up. However, if you really take a closer look at this line here, like let's say knight h5 here, knight takes e5, well, okay, if d takes e5, queen takes h5, yeah, we're down a pawn, but let's say we don't play d takes e5, let's say we play instead knight takes e5, and after queen takes h5, we are currently down a pawn here, but do we have any moves in that position? Well, yes we do. We can play knight takes d3 here, just to put that variation on the board, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, queen takes h5, knight takes d3, and now we are just simply a piece up in this position for a pawn, of course, but nonetheless here significant material advantage, and we are doing quite well. But notice how we had to do what I'm going to call going one move deeper here. This is the whole concept of this video. A lot of people would have just stopped here after knight h5 and they'd be like, oh, knight takes e5, I'm just losing a pawn here, this is no good. But you have to be like, well, hold on a second, is that really true here? And if you then check, okay, d takes e5, yeah, I'm losing a pawn here. What if I play knight takes e5, and then you check queen takes h5? Oh, I can indeed play knight takes d3, but you wouldn't have got to that point if you didn't stop yourself after knight takes e5 here and be like, wait, hold on, is this actually just winning a pawn, or do I have something myself there? And if you were able to successfully see all of this, then you would understand, of course, that knight h5 tactically is working because knight takes e5 is not a threat, and that because of that, you can put your knight in f4 in the next move, and you have a good position. And this is one of the things about calculation a lot of people sort of have a misconception about. A lot of people seem to think it's about calculating these lines at like 20 moves deep or so and finding all these like crazy sacrificial ideas, but a lot of the time it's simply like over the course of the game is going to be all these small moments where it's like, I want to play this idea, but my opponent sort of looks like they might be able to stop it with some sort of idea themselves, in this case 95, and whether you're able to calculate those like small 2 to 3 lines correctly, those can over the course of the game really ultimately decide the result. And to get into some more advanced examples now, this is a game that I had with the black pieces actually, but we're going to be looking at this from the white side here, where we have this sort of interesting position. Black has an isolated queen's pawn, but white has knight on g3 when it's usually on f3 because of the exact opening choice that my opponent chose here. Nonetheless, here we have a position which most people would say is maybe roughly equal. However, I did something very interesting on this move with the black pieces. I played knight g4 here. Now to querying, I'm going to basically be trying to absolutely destroy white on the king side, with my next move being to play queen h4. Once again, this is only possible because of the knight's sort of slightly strange placement on g3. If the knight was an f3, of course, this whole operation would not really be possible. But nonetheless, here my opponent had a real sort of choice he was faced with here, and if some of you would actually like to try and take the time to figure out what you would play with white here, I highly suggest you do so. But nonetheless here, basically what I assume was going through my opponent's mind here, because this was also a rapid game over the board, by the way, where he started spending a lot of time. He spent maybe like 10 minutes or so, and he went down from like 15 to about 5 minutes on the clock. And he ultimately ended up playing this move bishop e2, which I don't necessarily think was the best here. However, what a lot of you may have been thinking was that if you go a move like h3 here, which looks very natural on the surface here, then that's probably blundering material due to something like knight takes e3 or knight takes f2 here. The point being, in both of those cases, let's say knight takes f2 for example here, well, if rook takes f2, then bishop takes g3, and black just sort of seems like the upper pawn here. But again, it's like we need to look deeper than just this. On the surface that may seem so, but is there anything we can do? And if you really take a good look at the position here, black doesn't really have any defenders around their king, as you can see. They just sort of have these pawns which are kind of just eye candy for these bishops here right now. And it turns out that on this move, white can play bishop takes h7 check here, and if black takes it, which we can't really, then queen h5 check, and this is simply going to be ending in mate. And if you instead don't take it, well, there's still problems. Like, let's say king f8 here, rook takes f7 check here, takes queen f3 check. And yes, okay, black is up in exchange here, but look at this. The king's on e7. We have the bishop here. This is a threat. Our rook could be coming along here somewhere. It's not looking good for black. And the similar ideas here after h3 here. If we play knight takes e3, it's basically the same thing here. Bishop takes, you still get bishop takes h7 here. So that's also not too good. Basically in the game here, I have to say, I wasn't completely unaware of these sorts of ideas. I missed bishop h7, but I was like, okay, well, if they play queen f3, I can play queen c7. And then I can protect this and protect this. And I thought I should be okay. So basically, long story short here, all these sort of tactical ideas I thought I had with my knight jumping in here, trying to make use of the tactically vulnerable knight on g3. It didn't really work yet, and yes, I could play knight g5 here and sort of try and attack this bishop. Apparently, according to the engine, f4 is quite good here. You give up the knight squared bishop, which is a bit counterintuitive, but then you basically try to like hop your knight in somewhere, you bring your rook around, you maybe push the f pawn. This bishop's quite annoying, this diagonal here, and white has a bit of an advantage. I'm not sure whether my opponent would have played that, but still, nonetheless here, my opponent should have went for this, really trying to kick this knight out of g4 here, but the only reason they didn't was because they rejected these lines, which were actually good for them. It's just that they didn't go to the effort of looking again one move deeper here to see that, like, oh, like, yeah, okay, well, black wins a pawn here, but actually I'm just absolutely destroying him on the king side and he's getting mated. And this also kind of plays into this element, which we might talk in another video. It's quite important that I was a higher rated player in this game here. I was like 2200, my opponent's like 1900, 2000. So he sort of had this inherent trust that, like, oh, okay, this guy plays knight g4. He must sort of have an idea after h3 here, this sort of stuff must be working for him. Instead in the game though, just briefly showing what happened here, bishop e2 is played here, and basically the idea is if I go queen h4 here, he can take here and win a pawn on d5, and apparently I'm like having enough compensation after rook e6. During the game I wasn't completely sure of this, I was a little bit shaky. Apparently, like, if h3 is something you can just like take, I don't know, I haven't looked at this too deeply, although I can imagine something like this could work. But instead though in the game, instead of queen h4, what I did here was I played the very interesting looking move h5 here, basically backing up the knight instead of with the queen, with the pawn here. And the point is clearly that if you just take this, then your king's getting screwed over and you're just completely losing, because look at this. So my opponent tried some other stuff in the game here. He played bishop takes g4, takes, and I just got a big positional advantage here, provoking all sorts of weaknesses in my opponent's camp. And soon enough I won, but it was actually on time because, as I stated again, this was a rapid game and my opponent just let his flag fall eventually. So this is another good example here. This was a classical over the board game. It was a bit of a weird time control, 60 minutes plus 10-second increment. The 10-second increment, if you get into time trouble, it's basically death, honestly. But luckily in this game, I was not the one who was in time trouble. It was actually my opponent, which somewhat incentivized my next move here, which was basically, I mean, if you look at this, there are two sorts of main options that white has. One is you take the knight here, and then you play queen takes g7 here, and you sort of just try and, like, okay, if we look at the material balance here, essentially we would have a pawn for the exchange here. But the computer even says, I think queen takes d6 is actually a bit better than rook takes. But anyways, this sort of position here, we're attacking this. The pawn structure is a bit shattered on the king side here, and it's not so easy for black to really get their rooks into the game here. So in spite of black's extra material here, according to the engine here, white's even slightly better, which I can actually quite understand from a human perspective. Like, it's not so easy to move this rook, for example, because if you ever do this, you hang this pawn, and now we have a dangerous pass h pawn. However, during the game here, again, as I mentioned, my opponent was in time trouble. They were down to like less than a minute or so, and with the 10-second increment here, I thought I could kind of throw some dangerous stuff at them with this move knight c5 here. The idea being immediately that, okay, knight a6 is clearly a cheapo threat here, but I was also thinking, like, okay, if they sidestep to king c8, I can probably get some like bishop h3 checks here. Okay, they can play f5, but then I get like knight e6 or something. And then I was like, okay, well, if they go to king a8, which maybe is the most natural move here, then I can maybe play knight takes b7. Well, and okay, maybe it's a bit sort of weak for this sort of position. You need to be very sure of this sort of thing working, and unfortunately, I just kind of assumed like, oh, okay, yeah, knight takes b7, that probably works, because the idea is if I play knight c5 here, king a8 takes here, knight takes b7, I can play d6 here, and then I sort of have the bishop and rook converging in on this b7 square here. I can probably take on check if like knight takes there or something. Just to illustrate very briefly here, something like this I thought would be possible, and then, like, I mean, look, how can this not be good, right? But unfortunately, this whole concept was wrong in multiple ways. To begin with, after knight takes b7 here, what I soon noticed after my opponent played king a8 here was that, crap, if I take this, he doesn't even have to take this. He can just play rook b8 here, take the rook here, my bishop isn't going to get opened on this diagonal because I can't push my d pawn up the board, and if I move my knight out of the way, then I simply hang my rook on b1 and I'm busted. So I was like, okay, that clearly does not work here. But then also, unfortunately, even if he just taked it and was kind of stupid, not saying my opponent was stupid by the way here, or he would be stupid if he played this, because it actually works after just simply rook takes d6 here. And if I take the bishop here, just simply queen takes b7. My opponent's up a rook here. If I take here, I hang the rook here. If I take this, I hang this, and I'm again down a rook. So none of this really worked. And also, if I, by the way, play rook takes b7 check here, sorry, it's not even check here, the idea being that if I takes here, I take and like, I mean, I'm only down exchange here, maybe I have like some sort of like weird wacky stuff where I'm attacking a bunch of pawns and have compensation. Even this doesn't really work because unfortunately just queen c1 check here, and you just bypass all of that stuff here. My queen's hanging, if I have to retreat with the bishop, then just simply rook takes d4 and I'm down like who knows how much material. Of course I'm busted. But coming back to this position, right, given that knight takes b7 didn't really work, and also rook takes b7, I should note this also doesn't really work because it's just after king b8. I have all these like very loose pieces. Black also has for my two minor pieces, two rooks here, so obviously if I don't really have any clear attacking chances here, I'm just kind of busted. So what really went wrong here? And by the way, I should note I did end up winning the game here. I played h4 here, a bit of a waiting move, but that wasn't really due to the fact I played knight c5. That was just sort of a bit of luck, and again the time trouble my opponent in here. The real mistake I made was just sort of, and this happens a lot, people sort of, their calculation is very sort of loosey-goosey. They're like, oh, okay, yeah, like, they go king a8, I probably have some knight b7 stuff and d6, but they haven't actually properly calculated it, and they haven't really sort of internalized it, like, oh, what if my opponent actually plays this here, and now I'm actually going to take on b7 here. It's sort of like this fantasy they have in their mind that's separated from the reality that's on the board. At the very least, that's sort of what was happening to me, which is very strange. I don't know, like, if I was expecting my opponent to just blunder knight a6, which I mean, given my opponent's rating was like 2000 or something, pretty unlikely, but this is something a lot of people sort of go through in their games. They're like, okay, hopefully my opponent just blunders this, but if they play the most logical move, this thing which probably doesn't work here, let's just hope it works. Like, that's a very bad mindset to have here. I was just sort of not looking one move deeper once again, seeing that, oh, okay, my opponent doesn't even have to take here, they can go rook b8. And once again, this very forced variation that you should at least make sure does work, even this didn't work, and again, that was because I didn't properly calculate this. I just kind of assumed that something worked here. You shouldn't just assume shit like this works. That's a very bad mentality to have. So for the final example in this video, I want to show one game of mine from last year that I actually didn't play so badly compared to some of the others in this video. So right off the bat here, it's black to move here, and by the way, I was playing against Sophia Master, who was a bit higher rated than me at the time of this game. And basically at the moment I am threatening to play bishop takes h7 check here, which would win a pawn. So black has a couple logical options. Maybe they could play h6, maybe they could play knight f6 here, and after bishop d3 then sort of consider what to do. Maybe h6 here. They can't quite go c5, which is a move they would like to, because then they would just simply hang a pawn. After this variation, I'd play bishop e4 and consolidate my extra pawn here. So with this in mind here, after something like h6 maybe instead of c5, I could probably put rook fe1, and this is sort of what my opponent wanted to avoid, I think, because it's not so easy to get in c5 here. I can maybe play knight e5 in the next move, because if we go c5, now I can use the fact my rook's on e1 and play d5 here, and now this pin here on the e file is very unpleasant for black to deal with. They can't easily take the d pawn here, and they are struggling quite a bit here. For example, if we were ever to take on the e6 here and give them an isolated e pawn, that would be very unpleasant. But even if we don't, we just can ramp up the pressure here, double on the e file, and win this pawn outright one day maybe. Again, very unpleasant stuff for black to deal with. So my opponent didn't really want to go into this, and he instead played f5 here, which is a very aggressive approach, let's say. And sometimes it can work here if black plays c5, because like for example here, if we just like do nothing, we play rook fe1 here, black's gonna take here, give us a shattered pawn structure, and now like shoot their queen to h4 maybe, and they get a very aggressive position. But I had seen this idea coming like 3 or 4 moves earlier before I kind of allowed this whole thing to happen on the board, and I thought that after this move d5, which is a very thematic way to deal with the c5 break here, that I should be doing fairly well here, as after e takes d5, which is the most logical move, note you can't play a move like e5, black would ideally like to do this positionally, but after bishop takes f5 here, you simply lose a pawn. If they'll say a pawn on g6 here, then this would be very good for black, I think. But unfortunately, that wasn't really the case here, and after this move e takes d5 here, I already have a bit of a choice for what I can do here. For example, I could take here, but I could also maybe take here, and I ended up rejecting this for the reason that I didn't really like. Well, okay, I'm threatening this at the moment here, and if black played a move like this, I could just simply take, and then I'm just kind of mating them. I didn't think that was good for them, but what I did think they could do, and probably what my opponent would have done, was to play a move like rook takes f5 here, rook f8, and then like go d4 here, get this past d pawn on the board, open the bishop up. He also has the bishop here, I should note, and just sort of have all of these like open files around my king side. And this felt very uncomfortable from an intuitive point of view, so I decided to avoid this. It turns out like I had some other moves instead, queen c2, like queen g5, trying to create a queen trade. But even so, I still like what I did more in the game here, which was to play c takes d5 here. Basically saying that like, okay, I don't really want to give black the chance to like sacrifice exchanging it past d pawn here. I'd much rather sort of try and keep the initiative here, trying to like get my rooks onto the open files. Imagine one day if I could get like a knight into e6 somehow, that would be very cool. And if black takes this, I thought I wasn't going to play bishop takes f5 because, again, I thought ideas like this, something I probably want to avoid. However, my opponent missed a critical idea in this position here, which was that I could play bishop c4 here. And you could say this was the case of my opponent cutting his calculations one move too early, but this in fact wasn't even what I really wanted to show. But just to briefly show what's going on here, well, it's very difficult for my opponent not to take here. Let's say they go queen f7, trying to keep the tension here. One, I can go knight g5 maybe, but two, also I think I can just take here. And after rook a d1 here, there's just so much pressure on these files, I can probably just go like queen d2, and you can't go rook f6 to protect this because I'd take you, and if you move this bishop out of the way, then you hang the knight d7, so you're just done for, obviously. And if you take on c4 instead of this, just queen takes c4 check, this is what happened in the game here. If you go queen f7 here, thinking that you can exchange queens after something like this, and like, oh, I'm just a pawn up, maybe in this variation that's true, but we don't have to take on c4, sorry, f7 naturally. You can just go rook a d1 here, and the problem remains, how do you defend this? You can't really, so if you move it, then rook takes d7, and we're just simply winning the piece here because, of course, the pin here. And if king h8 has happened, the game here, rook f e1, I bombard you on the d file here, and this is what happened in the game here. My opponent actually just ended up resigning here. It was a very quick game. It finished in like maybe less than an hour, which given the time control 90 plus 30 was a little bit amusing. But nonetheless here, what I really wanted to show was not flexing on my win here. It was really that in this position here, after bishop, instead of bishop d5 rather, the line that really I was proud of for calculating in this whole game was that what happens after queen f7 here? I knew that bishop d5, bishop c4 was sort of wrong here, and I was very surprised, I should note, that my opponent, like, move after move just kept surprising me. They kept, like, being so compliant here, and I'm like, wait, is this really happening? Isn't my opponent just losing? Because he wasn't really hesitating with his moves. He didn't have any facial reactions. I couldn't tell if he was, like, he secretly had some idea which like countered all this stuff, but then he just eventually, like, in this position resigned. I'm like, oh, okay, so the guy just was having a bad day maybe. But nonetheless here, queen f7, I thought this was quite critical here, because now, like, if I just move a rook here or something, right, I was like, okay, black can probably just take this, and I mean, bishop c4 obviously just doesn't really quite work the same now, because they just consolidate in time, and like, this doesn't really quite work the same. Obviously, if rook d1, they can just play rook d8. And I didn't really want to play like bishop c4 here, and yes, I could sort of get the variations we looked at earlier by transposition, but just putting the bishop on c4 alone, this bishop doesn't feel very nicely placed here, and black can probably, I thought, like, consolidate in time with moves like rook a8, knight e5 and stuff, so I wasn't really a big fan of this either. However, what I was looking at in this position was, can I get knight g5 to work? I thought if I could get this to work, this variation must be good for white here. Basically, the idea is, okay, they can't take here because bishop c4 just wins the queen straight up. However, the line that bothered me really here was that what happens if queen h5 here, attacking this, because of course the bishop's also hidden the square and also hidden the knight on g5. Because obviously, if I play a cowardly move like knight f3 backwards, that probably is just not going to be good. However, what I had saw was that, like, okay, in this position here, if, like, this was even way back here, I think I was starting to calculate all these lines here. Like, okay, if I play c takes d5, queen f7 here, they're fronting this now, I thought. So, okay, knight g5, queen h5 here. I'm visualizing, like, okay, my knight has moved out of the way, so my f pawn can move. So maybe I can play, like, f4 in this position. So let's come back forward to this position, not this one here. Queen f7 here, knight g5, queen h5, and I was like, okay, one move deeper, f4 here. Let's see what's happening here. And then I was like, okay, this looks quite good here. I'm threatening this. My knight could come to e6 now. I don't have to worry about this queen h2 bullshit. But what if they play bishop f4 here? And then, oh crap, rook f4 here, queen g5, and they're winning the pawn now. But then I was like, hold on, not so far. Let's look even one move deeper again here. So if rook f5 here, now I'm actually winning the pawn here. Takes, I'm hitting this, I'm also hitting this. Let's say they go knight f8 here. Well, what's the material count? I'm like, material is equal, but I have the bishop pair. I also have this passed d pawn here. I should probably be doing better here, I thought. And so for that reason, coming back to this position here, there was a lot of thought that actually went into this playing c takes d5. It wasn't just looking to bishop d5 here. And I was like, okay, if that whole variation didn't work, I guess I'd play bishop f5 and go into this whole thing. I probably am still better there. But then once I was able to make this whole variation work, I was like, okay, this is what I'm going for. And it turns out that I even missed a better move somewhere in this variation here. I think was like rook f3, and even more brutal than just rook takes f5 as a threat is actually rook g3 here. And if black plays g6, sort of seemingly dealing with both of those threats here, we have the very subtle move bishop c4, which was way beyond my horizon, especially to calculate all the way back from this position, right? But nonetheless here, bishop c4, it makes a lot of sense here. I just have to find where we are. Here we go, where essentially g6 opens up this diagonal for the bishop, and now d6 is a very difficult threat to deal with here, and basically white is just winning. And you know, maybe if we got to this position, I could like think a little bit and find that resource eventually, but what was really important was I pushed myself a lot in these variations. The first one being here that I didn't just give up and be like, okay, I just have to retreat the knight. I visualized correctly that, okay, my knight has moved out of the way here, I can push my f pawn up. Okay, they can take it, that seems kind of bad, but okay, I can actually take here, I can win back the material, add the bishop here, and I should be doing fairly well. And as it turned out, none of this was sort of necessary for how the game developed, but nonetheless here, if my opponent was in a bit better shape, maybe this would have turned out to be necessary, and I was quite proud of the fact that I was able to kind of calculate this correctly. But nonetheless here, this is a very important lesson in calculation I want to share with you guys today here. I've talked about this a bit in the past, but I want to really make a kind of proper video dedicated to this, show some like good examples from my own games and how this sort of played out in action, some mistakes, some good moves that I've made sort of following or rejecting this principle. But nonetheless here, once again, please like the video, subscribe if you're not already, and leave a comment down below if there's any content you'd like to see from me in the future. But nonetheless, I hope you guys all have a good day.